Welcome to Just Think About It with Nadine and Ben. Before we start our conversation, we have two key requests. First, if you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe via Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your platform of choice. And second, we appreciate any kind notes as we get started and letting your friends know where to find us. Well, I was a kid and waiting for her birthday today. I'm so excited to introduce everyone to an expert in the field of AI and ML, as well as an expert on trends in India. Subha Tatavarti, the recently former Chief Technology Officer at Wipro. Wipro is a $30 billion public company with 245,000 employees across 65 countries that specializes in global IT, consulting, and business process services. So she has had her finger on the pulse of every major technology trend around the world and how companies are implementing solutions. Previously, she was the Senior Director of Tech Commercialization at another small company you might know called Walmart, and she worked at PayPal for over a decade, including as head of product, data platform, and infrastructure. She's an advisor to a host of tech companies and ventures such as Stellantis, Sierra Ventures, Stripes, and OpenSSF. She's also a management consultant at Abbott Labs, Fannie Mae, Bearing Point, and is a regular speaker at conferences such as the Fortune Brainstorm Tech 2024 conference. I love it when we can bring a worldwide leader that I also get to call a friend. Subha spurred me into getting a new road bike so we could tackle hills around Silicon Valley together. So welcome, Subha. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm excited to be here.
You know, as we were talking before, the expectations are so high for AI and ML. And while we've started to see some cracks here during earnings season, so for example, Microsoft punting on when they'll actually see revenues from all their spend, Google's CEO essentially admitting that there's likely overinvestment going on. Sequoia coming out with a report indicated there's 500 to 600 billion revenue hole currently, amongst other things, although NVIDIA reported this week and people seem to be somewhat okay with that. But there's really a lot of lofty expectations out there. So ground us, Subha, what is reality? How is this stack evolving?
See, there's a couple of trends that excite me about generative AI as a technology, and a couple of metrics more than any other data or technology evolution in the last decade or two. And here's why. What we've seen as a trend is commoditization of software and infrastructure, right? 20 years ago, we saw commoditization of compute network and storage. We thought it was impossible. We thought it was impossible to take workloads and be able to run them on a third-party commoditized hardware, which now has evolved into its own slew of technology stack that gives us faster time to market, better reliability and availability, and greater efficiencies. I see a very similar trend happening with commoditization of AI. And that's what I call this whole trend.
Okay.
And the goal is here to understand that the commoditization of AI itself is evolve in the next 5 to 7 years. That will give us significant benefits in terms of efficiencies, as well as at some point other benefits, like maybe changing business models. It is too early to call this a big revolution or to negate all the evolution of technology that is already beginning to show some really greater trends in terms of efficiencies, which was essentially the play and the biggest benefit coming out of commoditization of AI. So I would say it's too early. I think there is still time for the stack to evolve. And it is not about excitement around ROI already, but it's about excitement about to play in with this to see where things will evolve.
Okay. And you know, one of the things, and we've seen a large European company come out this week saying how much they're cutting, right? How many people they're cutting, more efficient spend. So do you expect solutions that are more additive to revenues, like new products and services that people are going to pay for? Or is it really solutions that are like reducing costs, like replacing employees? And why would you give the answer that you give?
Yeah, so again, as I said, kind of what I just said earlier, it's the earlier premise was around productivity gains. If you
Yeah.
really think about it, what this has done is it's reduced time to knowledge. Synthesis of information has become easier, faster, and tapping into knowledge has become ubiquitous. And I think that is something for us to realize, right? Given that it has time to knowledge and time to insights as virtue of time to knowledge reduction is trending, it will impact productivity in a more positive way, right? Meaning that your decisioning time will reduce, your action time, time to action will reduce, and it'll create the productivity gains that we all thought it would, and it is in certain use cases where it does not require a very high evolution of stack. As an example, you've seen the very first use case is around call centers and operations, where it is important to have contextual information of that product, that service, that call that a call center gets, which has shown to create benefits. So that's one. That's a very immediate use case we all are able to experience, whoever is in running technology organizations. But for the rest of use cases, not and a few others to kind of sort to see those benefits, the technology stack has to evolve, the tooling has to evolve, the accuracy has to evolve. And the accuracy evolution is forcing and creating these new layer of middleware where you're looking at newer grounding techniques, you're looking at different evolutions in caching. And what I'm trying to say with all of that is right now the good news is that we're seeing productivity gains in some of those low hanging fruits around synthesis of knowledge and time to insights. But I do believe that we can't write this off so early because the evolution itself might take some time. And I think that itself will change the workflows and why and the workforce itself.
So, so when we think about the reduction of time until knowledge, I like that concept.
Mhm.
We view that as kind of like a more advanced tool then at this point, as opposed maybe there's a definitional thing. Everyone's like, oh, artificial intelligence, and everyone thinks of Skynet running the world. But maybe it's more like, hey, this is just a huge improvement in a productivity tool, and we don't know yet what it can be in terms of a standalone technology that's a decision-making technology. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
I would, yes, and I would add that what folks don't understand, well, they do understand, but they're sometimes we forget is that AI has been around for some time, and we've used the biggest user of it has been banking and financial services for fraud and risk. And
Mm.
it has been used very successfully for a long time for decision making on fraud and risk cases, right? Even at runtime and near real time, point sub-second latency situations where you have to make a call, whether it's a fraud or a non-fraud transaction, and those have been around for some time. What we're seeing now is more contextual AI, which means that because of the new transformer model architecture, you're able to retain the context, and which means that you're able to not just have decisioning on the next token, but you're able to have decisioning on set of tokens which needs set of context, which then needs more set of context, which means it's becoming more and more recursive in nature, and hence it gives you a semblance of intelligence that is non-existent, but it still gives you that intelligent like interface, which is what has caused so much excitement. There are use cases for such contextual decisioning, which is more than fraud and transaction related use cases, but also more than just global ops and call center use cases. And that evolution in the next 3 to 6 months to a year is what is very exciting in this space.
And
Right. And so basically, I think you said that well. This isn't actually knowledge, but has the appearance of knowledge because we've never seen something, a model, for example, be able to spit out sentences. And there's many tail cases that you can exploit, that it's not actually working like the human brain works. But in essence, 99% of the time, it's able to detect fraud by clustering and all these ML techniques, right? And that's the better way to like think about it and not get
Mhm.
confused in what the media is saying or what the bears are saying, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's I think that's very helpful.
And Suba, when you think about the limitations or the key limitations to what exists today that are either getting tackled, do you think they're going to get tackled or maybe not? How would you kind of flip from the things that you're excited about to the things you say are most challenging right now?
See, this is where I feel the challenging side is around two areas. One is the cost itself, and that's
Okay.
why at some point, not at some point, very quickly, we will figure out how to manage costs of training new models. That's why you don't see a lot of players in building new models unless they have
Right.
massive.
Right. Money and people, right? Talent and people, talent and money. Yeah.
Exactly. So the cost constraints are going to be significant. And that's where the biggest evolution and biggest excitement is around the infrastructure layer, because training requires massive amounts of compute, GPU compute, which is very expensive. And we are seeing a lot of trends where there are multiple ways of tackling that constraint. One is around virtualization of GPU compute for stateful workloads. And stateful workloads virtualization has been a problem that is yet to be solved, at least publicly. I mean, I know a lot of companies, including major players, trying to solve for it. That's one way of tackling it. And the second way of tackling it is really figuring out how to train large amounts of data on commodity compute and with different training techniques and different algorithmic techniques. And that's another area of excitement. I forget the question, but I might be digressing.
The limitations to the current offerings, you're saying that's
Yeah.
kind of keeping things behind and
Yeah, and those limitations are definitely cost, biggest thing,
right.
right? And the other part of it is what we sometimes forget is the big jump is only 12 to 18 months old. I mean, in terms of like
Right.
the OpenAI's announcement and the whole hoopla about it, and the general public acceptability that generative AI or AI in general or statistical analysis of large data sets that gives you probabilistic outputs has been around for a long time, and
Right.
applying it for other use cases that are more deterministic in nature. And that deterministic in nature, that tolerance to that deviance is and fine tuning it to that tolerance and the deviance will take some amount of time. We sometimes forget that it is very recent, where we are applying it to other areas that
Right.
broadly to other areas.
And obviously companies are spending tens of billions of dollars on software infrastructure just to try to get up to speed. The earnings calls for the last 2 quarters, I mean, everybody is saying that they're spending on AI and ML. So are the big companies spending this capital just to stay competitive because their peers are spending? I mean, because you've had insight into why companies are doing things. Now, from a research analyst perspective or an investor's perspective, you kind of hear what the company wants you to hear. But when you think about it, management teams, let's say they weren't versed in AI and ML, is this just, hey guys, like we need to be doing this, and they're, flying from the seat of their pants? Are they breaking ground with new advancements? Does it really, you kind of mentioned a little bit, differ per industry? So maybe in financials, it's been there, they've been doing it, and maybe in small segments of what they do well for a while. But how do you think about the global market of what everybody's spending on, which we hear about, versus, do they know what they're doing? Do they know what they're spending on? Is this just because somebody else says they're doing it and they feel like they got to keep up?
I don't see, in every interaction I've had with any CXO, CTO who's responsible for technology, whether it's oil and gas, whether it is telco, whether it's healthcare, whether it is fintech, and you just take a whole broad spectrum. I have not seen a single CTO or a CXO or a CIO coming back to me and saying we don't have investments in this area. Almost
Okay.
everyone across every geography is investing in this area.
And have they been for a while? Or if they're investing now, has this been like a 12-month thing? Or is it mostly, is it short term, or they've been doing it for a long time?
So they have been doing it for a while, but the force of it and the significance of it and the volume of it has changed.
Okay.
Applicability of it is also changed, because now it's opened up the possibility of using AI for use cases that previously were not on their radar. And that has changed. What has also changed is a thinking about workforce in itself. We talk about flexible and right sizing fleet at compute level using AI on time series data. That was the next evolution. The next evolution of sales and marketing and AI. We've seen that.
Right.
Being AI in prediction, which has been around for a long time, right? But it was mostly contained to retail and others, where you're able to look at your entire supply chain and reduce the float to be more competitive from a cost perspective. But that has now elevated to that next level. We're saying, okay, how can we do it better, faster, and cheaper, but more rapidly? Because now you have a commoditized AI. Instead of trying to hire hundreds of data scientists to do it on my data set, can I use commoditized AI for me to be getting to the same level of maturity in some of these problems? So to answer your question, yes, there is general consensus that the need of investment is today, because we don't know where it is going, and I don't want to be left behind. If tomorrow, with higher degree of probability of if is much higher in terms of probability, I don't want to be left behind and gain, because once I know things come out of this technology, it'll be too late for me to kind of sort of invest in it and reap the benefits.
Right.
And so you think there's a bit of a FOMO, or the Google CEO said something there's more risk to underinvest than overinvest on this. But doesn't that create you're at a major corporation as an executive, doesn't that create a scenario where there could be a large overinvestment risk here, kind of like there was at the beginning of the internet, or like in the 1998 to 2002 period, where there had to be a digestion period until obviously it was one of the greatest technologies that we've ever had as humans? I mean, do you see something like that happen again?
That happens with every hype cycle, and I don't think we will not see that here. We are beginning to see that already. That is true for any hype cycle, but it always happens, and I don't think this is anything different either, right? Like in the 90s, late 90s, there was this massive hype cycle, but amazing companies came out of it. PayPal came out of it. Amazon came out of it. There's a bunch of other companies that came out of it, and Google came out of it. So I don't see that not happening here, but for all the right reasons, because there is early data that suggests that these kinds of investments, although they might at this time seem very somewhat of a hype cycle, will eventually result in some significant technology shifts, which will then result in significant business shifts that will impact the way we do work and the way we operate our businesses. So the short answer is yes.
I mean, and there's a great book by a guy from Franklin Investments, Franklin Templeton, that talked about it. It's railroads, phones. It's always the same thing. I mean, I enjoyed that answer. But when we think about the underlying technology for a second, one of the things that Nadine and I like to think about is the tails of the distribution, and that's where a lot of the information comes from. Even as humans, Beethoven or Michael Jordan or Ramanujan, some of the great thinkers, Da Vinci. So these models optimize for a curve, and they kind of disregard the tails, and then the hallucination problem. Can you speak to that? As is it actually technology can be relied upon when some just talk about that. I can respond after. I don't want it to be too long of a question. I apologize.
No problem at all. Yes, But there are techniques that are evolving. So it's always an 80-20 rule, and then you figure out what are the other techniques that are evolving to kind of create, to kind of help mitigate some of the that you just talked about. Um, I'll give you an example, right? We talked about grounding, and grounding is one of the techniques that are used to kind of make sure that you reduce hallucination, or the idea that you can have a more precise answer in a very probabilistic world. Now, grounding techniques are evolving. Used to be purely vector-based grounding. Now we are using graph databases to ground the data, both the question and the volume of information that is fed to get an answer. And then now we are looking into various caching techniques. The various caching techniques for used to be able to now cache the output and then ground the cached output again using graph databases. So creating a meta layer so that eventually you're able to take that probabilistic or not the probabilistic, but especially the idea that the answer is somewhat accurate to more accurate, and then eventually as accurate as possible. So there are these techniques that are evolving to create that kind of accuracy that is almost required for some use cases, and the ones that are somewhat the idea that you need less accurate information and data can be, because cost is always a factor in this case, can be then a direct throughput through to the commoditized LLMs. And the ones that require higher accuracy, you have all these other techniques that are evolving to create a more accurate answer. The point I'm trying to make through all of this is there are other techniques that are evolving to create or circumvent some of the situations that you just talked about, because saying that somehow by virtualizing compute, and I'll just go back to that for a little bit, virtualized compute can solve all your problems is not the right answer, because you need showback techniques, you need chargeback techniques, you need to make sure that your compute is highly available. If it is not available, you have clustering techniques. If the cluster fails, then you have other kinds of redundancy techniques. And similarly, the same situation is being applied here. You're evolving different techniques to be able to then mitigate some of the risks that come with a very probabilistic nature of a commoditized ML.
And so I totally hear that, but if we just keep on max likelihood, in a recursive nature, where is the risk reward, or where's the break even is maybe the better question, of if the power costs are material, unlike in past internet digital cycles, where's the break even? Because it's like there has to be some analysis of like that's enough, or is it we're just going to spend infinitely to get it to 99.99999? You know what I mean?
The use case, right? It all depends on the use case.
Yeah.
There is no reason for me to do that for a call center use case or a knowledge-based use case, but there might be a need for me if it is a mission-critical system, if I'm going to do something and applying it for
healthcare or something.
Exactly, healthcare. So it all depends on the use case. And sometimes the ROI calculation, that's what goes in, and you see what is the use case that requires this kind of optimization.
Absolutely. And humans do that too, if you think about how much we spend on the last 6 months of our lives in healthcare. So I understand that.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can talk about, where you kind of see the near term and then the long term returns, because one of the things we think about as investors is everybody's short term focused, and it seems as though, to Nadine's point, is that the cost savings part is the near term. But where do you think what people aren't thinking about right now, or at least people like us who aren't as deep in the weeds, or we don't run a corporation, where is the really big game changing opportunity for the economy from this, in your opinion?
The one area that excites me is, so let me take a step back before I answer the question, right? If you just look at just the macro trends in the past 20, at least I've been working for 26 years, so I'll just stop at 20 years, folks. We see a couple of things. One is that technology evolves, people get excited, there's a lot of investment, eventually just goes down to the real applicability. Like, okay, this is where it is really applied. And then a completely new family of businesses, economy, jobs, everything kind of starts to start mushrooming. And it just happens in cycles. The second part of it is, as you sort of narrow down on exactly where the applicability is, you start to put in levers for optimization, and that itself will then mushroom into newer job families, new businesses, newer investments, and newer technologies again. And as you then fine tune on the second layer of, or the second degree evolution of, technology, innovation, and so on and so forth, the third layer emerges, and so on and so forth. So we've seen that kind of trend, because AI wouldn't be here if there was no internet, and they wouldn't have had massive amounts of information on the internet, right? It is because of the massive amount of information on the internet and data that is generally available that we were able to then train large models to be able to give us what we have today. So if you were to apply these kinds of those trends, I think there's choke points that also begin to emerge. If you look at those patterns, the choke points was in the past compute, time to market, latency, because our evolution of distributed networks, being able to serve people just in time. So these kinds of different patterns are beginning to emerge. So when you ask me, where are the areas that we just applying that lens here, what are the areas that folks may not be looking at that might be quite interesting? Where it is very exciting to me is around power systems, the infrastructure that is very archaic, network. Those are the areas that will start to drive these new emerging trends around adoption of any technology, including generative AI. And I think the investments, if I were to look at long-term investments, that's the area that I would start to make. Today's vulnerabilities don't exist in human defended physical entities, but technology defended virtual entities. What I mean by that is our entire power grid is the biggest risk for our country, so to speak, right?
Okay.
How do you evolve that? How do you secure that? How do you distribute it? How do you become, this whole area of research that's happening there. How do you ensure that our supply chain is intact? So these are the areas that folks are not looking at, or maybe they are, but not necessarily, it's not hotly debated and hotly discussed topics. But those are the areas of exciting investments for me.
Yeah, we interviewed a friend of mine who trades physical power, and we talked about some of these things, and he got Nadine very nervous about the fragility of the power structure. So I appreciate you saying that.
And Subha, one of the questions around that is really, is that come down to private investment, or is that more government driven, the issues that you're talking about, the security, the availability, the capital spend? I mean, it seems like some of that has to be, I guess, done in a more centralized way, or no? Is this, who's responsible if we don't get there?
I think it should be both. I don't think it should be one way or the other, because look at what's happening with space. Right? Space tech, we all traditionally always believed to be very, very government sponsored sort of industry. But literally, coming out of the Fortune conference, I was amazed at how many startups in space tech are changing the landscape completely, right? I think it's, and you can just apply the same example here. I think it's both.
So before we might come back to power in a second, but I want to go to another topic, which I think everyone wants to hear about, which is labor, right? Because you're starting to see some notes, companies announce, well, I thought I was going to get rid of 3,000 people. Now I'm going to get rid of 5,000 people. And that is scary and exciting. As you said, there could be new businesses that then scoop up that later to do other things. But, depending on where you sit, It could be exciting or frightening. And so maybe you can share who is most likely to be displaced by these technologies and why. In the short run, right? For the first, doesn't mean they don't go get other jobs and retrained or elsewhere, but what are the kind of the low hanging fruit areas where companies look at it that way to say, well, I can replace, X with Y, versus from the human aspect of the people saying, well, am I safe or am I not safe?
Before that, if I can quote one of my peers in the industry who runs a very, very large technology organization for one of the largest banks in APMEA, said, if I take my 1960s data, 1970s data on how many workers I had versus today, it hasn't changed. It's been exactly the same. What has changed is the kind of workforce. It's gone from front office to now middle office and back office. So I will say the same. There is going to be a significant, not displacement, but retraining of workers, especially knowledge workers. Because going back to the time to knowledge metric, just one metric we just talked about. I remember when I started coding, I had no Google. I was dating myself. All I had was a bunch of books, and anytime I ran into errors, that's all I did. Like I would look at it and like, what is it throwing error?
Right.
Why is it not compiling, right? And then I remember anytime there was an error, all you had to do is cut and paste it on Google, and suddenly you would have like a bunch of answers, and you would just go in. Now you don't even need those errors. You'll have tons of startups now who are saying that you don't need a programmer. You're able to write code without necessarily ever coding. So you see the whole trend and change. Does that mean that we don't need knowledge workers? We don't need technologies? We don't need programmers? No, we do. But the focus areas change then. It might be, there was a lot of talk about prompt engineering, the right kind of prompts to be written. And most prompt engineering is done by subject matter experts and not programmers. However, for those set of use cases that require, say, questions around specific subject matters, whether it is supply chain, legal, so on and so forth. However, similar prompt engineering may be applied to, say, programming as well, where you might have to have exactly the right prompt for your generative AI model to generate the right snippet of code and your understanding of how the snippet of code is written so that you can troubleshoot for scale issues in the future. Or you might say that, so there is a significant amount of retraining, but that does not mean you don't understand the core fundamentals of programming, because you need to understand the fundamentals of programming for you to be able to then understand what's written and then troubleshoot if need be to in the future. So the kind of skills and the application of skills will definitely shift. We know that already. But I don't think there will be displacement of workers, but there might be retraining of workers in ways that is not, we can't conceive that yet or I won't be able to articulate it very well, but we definitely see that happening. And I think that is just a byproduct of the kind of technology evolutions. The number of books I read on an app versus physically it's shifted. I've never liked audiobooks, and now when I go for long drives, which I have to because I have two kids in two different coasts, I do audiobooks. So the point is how we
in our podcast, right? That too.
and yes, absolutely, huge fan, by the way. So that changes, and I think that's the meta point here. I feel.
And Subha, when I hear that knowledge workers, going by the wayside, or some of them, and also call centers, so they're kind of two different parts of the world. Is this deflationary? Meaning, is this going to displace a lot of people before they can be retrained and hired? Or how should we think about it from a company perspective? You're saying, well, companies might just keep the number of people, but if I can get rid of I just saw that Goldman's getting rid of thousands of people. If I get rid of my expensive people and I have maybe less expensive people, it's deflationary. Or do you think that that's really not a trend here? Is it just more, you're going to have the same people, you're going to pay them the same, they're just going to be maybe doing different jobs?
You might be paying different skill sets, the premium based on, the kind of skill sets that are paying premium today versus what kind of skill sets are we are we paying the extra? Um, See, that trend started to happen when we talked about chasing the dollar around the world with GCCs and
Yeah.
other trends in terms of my own former company where I worked, right?
Yeah.
So those kind of trends of replacing your knowledge workers with cheap labor somewhere else has been around for some time. The difference now is that potentially it could be a technology that is replacing
Right.
workers and not necessarily workers replacing workers in a different geo. And that's a real, it potentially is a real thing. The question is, are the companies going to take that stance or not?
Mhm.
Most publicly traded companies that owe their shareholders value will
Right.
try to figure out how to do businesses more optimally, and this is
Right.
one of the levers they do have. So yes, you will see that trend, but I don't see that trend as a threat to the workers that are being displaced. I see that as an opportunity to create a different kind of work, not work, but skill category. And that skill
Yeah.
category is emerging. I just want to be careful about these things because, there's sometimes it creates a lot of chaos and
Right, right. Whereas there's opportunity as well. I totally get it. It's
yeah,
like people think from fear often, but really they should also think from opportunity. Well, what is it that I could be doing
yeah,
that it's going to be like whether it's a new paradigm or just a shift in, as you call, business model or otherwise, or cost models. Where is the opportunity here?
yes.
Right.
And
And
Sorry, can I ask you one more question before I forget? Is like, so I've got a kid going into college, right? And I think I hear from a lot of parents as well as kids is like, well, what should I do? So if there's going to be speed to knowledge, or speed to decision making, like like what skill sets are going to matter when you think about it from a human perspective? If you could give advice to people, what is it that's actually going to matter then?
critical
Is it
thinking,
creativity, or maybe not? Like what is it?
it's definitely all the skills that have always mattered. it's
Okay.
it's critical thinking, it's creativity, it's being able to troubleshoot. See, eventually we are all doing our jobs, you, me, Ben, all of us, because of those skill sets. We
Uh-huh.
just apply them in different ways to solve for different problems. So critical thinking continues to be top. Structured troubleshooting comes from that. Being able to be creatively solve outside of the box thinking, where you're able to solve for problems when there is no apparent solution, is what we've done in our entire careers, and it continues to be a very important skills. And you don't get that unless you've had a very structured training for a sustained number of years, and hence college does matter. It's not about just coding in my field, it's about structured thinking, understanding the fundamentals of why compilers compile your code and why they run the way they
Mhm.
run, because eventually those are the skill sets you use to kind of create the next wave of technology or next wave of solutions or business models or what have you. So those critical functions and skill sets continue. It's a question of how do you enhance and how do you learn.
Right.
I mean, my son
Right.
goes to an engineering school, and my son goes to engineering school and wants to do something that might not be an industry in the next 5 years, but the training they get in terms of how to structurally think in a structured fashion continues to be very, very important skill sets. So I don't think things will significantly change. It's how you
Change. Okay.
apply those skill sets and knowledge will change. And you have more tools than you've ever had in the past to be able to be more effective in a very short period of time. And that's how I see the world.
Okay. Well, thank you. Sorry, Ben. I wanted to make sure we had that there.
no, it's okay. I mean, it's interesting if you think about that, because that's kind of the geo cost driving down. Whether it was initially making shoes and apparel, to then it was knowledge workers. Then is the Eastern European or maybe Indian, like where a lot of the cheaper coders, people who kind of brought the cost curve down, maybe more at risk now, because the high cost guys have been at risk for a while in, call it the Europe, or especially in America and California where we are right now. Is it maybe these are retraining, and those people are more at risk because they're maybe not as creative, they're more systematic. Is that maybe the next phase of this?
I think those markets will evolve. They have to evolve. They haven't evolved in the last. I mean, they have evolved to an extent, but they don't. They have. There hasn't been a pressure or a force that is forcing them to evolve. There's two kinds of pressures happening in some of these markets, right? One is the GCCs. Every company I know of has now opened their own GCCs. The need for them to now tap into a company that has all these knowledge workers for hire is coming down significantly because for various reasons. The second is those markets are also evolving because of this whole technology evolution. The idea that one of the startups that I know got funded a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars in Series A to just build base models to write code, and there is another startup that I know of that is just been funded for just to build analytics and AI analytics solutions. So you don't need any other analytics on the data that you may have internally is a real threat. So these companies will need to evolve, and I think they will evolve because the economies will drive them to evolve, and the ones that don't evolve will have issues. But the good news is, in some of these same countries are now the hottest startup ecosystem areas too. So there's this interesting trends that are occurring, which is fascinating to observe.
And can I ask you a question about large versus small? So before we head on to some other topics, I run a small business, if you want to call it, in terms of number of employees, and because it's an asset management business. But it's obviously we hear of really large public companies and how much they can spend on creating solutions here and investing in infrastructure. But what about the small, medium businesses? At what point, I mean, who just don't have the talent, don't have maybe even the networks to figure out what to do. At what point does it affect the smaller companies out there? Is it just waiting for startups to create, apps or other kind of solutions for them to use? Or how do you think about the impact on that segment of companies?
Um, that's a very good question. You're right. There is going to be some force or some sort of pressure for them to sort of adopt some of these because the larger companies have higher, in terms of their resources
And talent and everything.
and the
Yeah.
talent and everything. Um, most of these small and medium-sized businesses, especially the medium-sized businesses, I think the way I've seen them survive is or thrive, and we do in my previous job and even today I interact with a lot of companies that are mid-market. And medium-sized as well as small businesses, is niche, is very, very, yeah, and not everybody's able to do well in every segment. Some do exceedingly well in some areas, and then they create a dominant market dominance. And some of the technology that is specifically geared towards that vertical, I see a lot of consolidation happening in that space. As an example, there is generative AI for legal software. There is a massive amount of consolidation as well as competition. And the smaller and medium-sized players are beginning to see how they can consolidate to become a dominant player, where the likes of, say, some of these large global players don't have the need or the desire to compete or the agility to compete as effectively as some of these smaller players. But I don't see that as a problem, but I see that as a huge strength as long as they're able to differentiate themselves in a specific area and do exceedingly well in that specific area.
Thanks.
I think we've touched on it a little bit, but maybe let's hammer on it. The power side of it is that the bigger constraint than the capital side? Like you see Microsoft and Amazon and a few of these guys literally securing full power plant forward supply, and they're only doing that because they're concerned about the actual supply of power, right? Not in generation. So is there, instead of capital being the constraint, which it really hasn't been for a long time, or labor, as the world's expanded and India and China and now the African labor supply have come online, is now physical power the actual constraint that will hold, be on the system?
I think the physical resources will be a constraint. I do believe that. Yeah, materials, example, right? Power is one of them, absolutely. But even materials, that will be biggest concern. I have seen a lot of trends, and interestingly enough, one of the largest power supplier. I've never seen this before, by the way. This is the first time. Based out of Australia, they are literally moving from just pure power company to a power tech company for the first time. It's the idea that how do I make sure that I'm competing in my markets? And I was quite surprised, like if you're the monopoly, who are you competing with? But the interesting part of it is that private players are beginning to come into play because they're understanding and recognizing that this will be the biggest constraint for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Same thing with materials and supplies as well, like, commodity materials. There is a lot that is going on in that space that we're maybe a lot of people I know have not yet focused on, but it's fascinating, and some are early. They've recognized early enough to create some sort of pivots, and it's interesting to see the trend there.
So what exactly is the power company doing to be a power tech company? What are there concrete things that they're doing that you could mention?
One of the things that was fascinating to me is the users have the power, or the capability. It's become more customer centric experience. So I'm able to choose what I want on a just in time basis as a consumer of power in my home. And they're doing the same thing for businesses as well. They are able to create different sources. The demand for customers is changing. They're looking for more sustainable source. So for instance, I can have source A, B, and C. I can say I want consumption patterns in a certain way. And all of that used to be through a broker, or you had like only 2 or 3 options. But
Sure.
now consumers are able to bundle options and bundle sources and be able to change just in time based on their usage patterns. And this is for consumer side. I've never seen something like that. It's almost like consumer retail sort of experience for a power utility or a utility company.
Wow. Well, I think we need that. My power went out this week one day. So here in Silicon Valley, maybe Australia can come and teach us something here.
Yeah.
And going back to a topic that Ben brought up in India here. So obviously India was one of the EMs that was really outperforming this year versus China that continues to underperform for a whole host of reasons. But the incredible growth of the countries led to a lot of capital flows into the public markets there. And we talked about the 3 things that India and Silicon Valley share: education, money, talent. Can you explain what the tech and startup ecosystem looks like in India for our listeners, since you have your finger on the pulse there, and folks over here may or may not be as well versed in that?
So I'll give you a few data points. We looked at the number of startups that were seed or pre-seed in a generative AI space in some capacity I have outside of my previous job. And we came down to 2,400.
2,400?
2,400 startups in AI and generative AI, which are seed and pre-seed. Yeah.
Okay.
Of those 2,400, majority of them were in 3 areas. And this is a new trend: Israel, Silicon Valley, and Bangalore, or mostly India.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the globe, in the world, right?
Yeah.
Of which 800 of them were primarily based out of India.
Wow. You got a third there.
And the generative AI, these startups are in every layer of the Gen AI stack: application, to compute and traverses the entire stack. It's just one of those, this is one data point to kind of
put it in perspective for people, right?
exactly. The
And
other
in terms of funding, though, is it mainly U.S. firms looking to stake a claim there? Is it local capital that's funding them? Who's funding it over in India?
it's both. There are a lot of US based large VC firms that have major offices in India now, and it's been a trend for the last 5-7 years. And the majority of a lot of action is happening in India in terms of investments. Many investors in India are now becoming LPs for major
Yeah.
players and VCs in the US. So that's the second trend. And the third is Freshwork is just one of the examples. There are many startups that start in India, emerge, and then they're in late stage and with pre-IPO, they move to the Silicon Valley. So the Silicon Valley Bangalore corridor is becoming almost a highway, if I may say so. In the past, it was not the case. So it's interesting. And the second trend, I know it's not related to startup, but almost every company that I spoke with in the past years that are not based out of the US are looking to either hire talent or hire technology talent from India, or figure out how to work with the startup ecosystem there, or have investment arms, their venture arms that have investments in India. So this has been a significant shift. And going back to your earlier question, Ben, around like knowledge workers shifts, does it impact? What is fascinating to observe is the knowledge worker shift is happening, but now they're creating value and not just being a worker creating value for an entity that resides outside of that country. They're creating value for within that country. And that is huge. And I think I can, it's very perceptive. I wouldn't say the right word. It's not perceptive. You can perceive the
Palpable.
shift.
It sounds like it feels
Thank you.
palpable is that word. I know you had the P. I was with you there mentally. Yes.
It's a palpable shift. Yes.
And are they solving problems for India, or would you say they're solving problems for the world?
It's both.
Yeah.
India is very unique. I was fascinated when I had someone order their own equivalent of Uber Eats for dinner once, and it's interesting how it operates. Not just Uber Eats; they have actually apps that I'm just giving you an example. Where you can order or grocery online, but the delivery is within 20 minutes. And given if you visited India, their infrastructure is not conducive for a 20-minute. So their entire supply chain and delivery mechanism is completely evolved, right? If you think about it, they have a hub um, within 2 to 3 kilometers of every large residential area, which means they have many, 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 many hubs for which act as their supply chain network. You can order a small one soap or bar, or literally one soap bar.
Really?
Ordered it, yes, and they don't charge you extra for it. As long as you pay a monthly fee, you can order anything and everything. It doesn't matter. And
Are they making money?
yes, that is the fascinating part. And the reason for that is because of their supply chain imagination,
Okay.
serving for their local markets. So, yes, they're solving for their local markets, but that is the longest pole. If you solve for a local market, it's the longest pole, then you've solved for
Everything else, yeah.
cases. And that is very interesting to see, and how they're being very, very successful outside of their own markets because they solved for their, the longest pole, which is quite fascinating.
And are there specific opportunities where either you are an investor, you'd like to be an investor or entrepreneur when you look at this space, either because there's massive growth potential or a way to create a barrier to entry or a barrier to compete? Where are the hot areas that if you were starting out, what you would do or where you would invest?
I would look at GPU infrastructure virtualization. That's one thing that fascinates me. I look at power and the whole utilities vertical. That is very fascinating to me. I would look at supply chain. Supply chain is changing. Supply chain will change, and there'll be a big demand on supply chain, reimagining supply chain itself. There is a big trend of globalization, but localization, which means I'm a global company, but I'm very, very local. The feel is very local. And that localization itself is changing. The example I just talked about is very interesting. I would look at commodities, which is going to be the biggest choke point for in the next 5 to 7 years. And overall, I think I would look at financial services companies that are catering to some of these 5, 6 different verticals that I just talked about. Just get a hedge on the meta side of things, like meta, which means you have financial companies that are looking at some of these trends and then being able to invest it. So those are some areas that I would look at.
Well, thank you. I know we're coming up here on an hour. And so, Subha, and I know we can spend hours with you because I do spend hours with you. So thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and experience with us and our listeners today. But if people want to reach out and find you, either find out what you're doing, what you're thinking, where is the best place to do that?
I'm available and very open on LinkedIn. So
okay.
LinkedIn or
so LinkedIn.
Yes, and Nadine, you have my coordinates, and
okay.
and
don't bug me for her though. I don't want to pump people to you too much, but I'll curate. How's that? I'll curate for you. But Subha, thank you so much for spending your time and expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.